She stared at her phone screen, hands trembling, as the numbers appeared. $2.3 million. Sarah Mitchell screamed with joy, hugged her daughter, called her husband with tears streaming down her face. This was it. They were finally free. But exactly 1 year later, she'd be sitting in that same spot, staring at a different number. $38,000. And her husband would be in a hospital bed after trying to end his life. How does someone lose over $2 million in 12 months? How does a blessing become a curse that destroys everything you love? This is that story, and I need you to pay attention, because what happened to Sarah could happen to anyone. But before we get into this devastating story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this, real stories about real people facing impossible situations, are what we do here. And if this story resonates with you, if it makes you feel something, drop a like so I know you want more content like this. Now, let's dive into how Sarah's dream became her worst nightmare. Sarah was 32 years old, working double shifts as a nurse at County General Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Her hands were always dry from washing them 100 times a day, her feet ached constantly, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a full night's sleep. Marcus, her husband of 7 years, worked in construction, and together they were barely making ends meet. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Emma who had asthma, and the medical bills were piling up faster than they could pay them. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment where the heating barely worked in winter, and every month was a careful dance of deciding which bills to pay first and which ones could wait just a little longer. Sarah's uncle Robert had been a successful real estate developer in North Carolina, a man she'd only met a handful of times at family reunions. He was her mother's brother, and they'd never been particularly close. He had no children of his own, and when he died suddenly of a heart attack at 68, Sarah was shocked to learn she was named as a primary beneficiary in his will. The lawyer who called her that Tuesday morning explained that after taxes and other distributions, Sarah would receive approximately $2.3 million. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having in her entire lifetime. That night, Sarah and Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, staring at each other in disbelief. Emma was already asleep in her room, and they could hear the neighbor's television through the thin walls. Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the lawyer's business card. Marcus kept running his fingers through his hair, a habit he had when he was overwhelmed. They talked for hours about what this meant. They could pay off their debts, all $28,000 of credit card bills and medical expenses. They could buy a house with a backyard for Emma. They could finally breathe. Sarah could cut back her hours at the hospital and actually spend time with her daughter. Marcus could start the carpentry business he'd always dreamed about. This was their chance, their one shot at the kind of life they'd only seen other people living. The money arrived 6 weeks later, deposited into their bank account on a Friday afternoon. Sarah logged into their online banking on her phone during her lunch break at the hospital, and when she saw the balance, she had to sit down. The numbers didn't even look real. $2,347,812. She took a screenshot and sent it to Marcus with 3 exclamation points. He called her immediately, his voice cracking with emotion. They decided to be smart about it. They weren't going to be like those lottery winners who blow everything and end up broke. They were going to be responsible, careful, intentional. The first thing they did was pay off every single debt they had. The credit cards, the medical bills, Marcus's truck loan, everything. Sarah felt physically lighter watching those balances drop to zero. Then they started looking at houses. They found a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood with good schools, a house with a big kitchen and a fenced backyard where Emma could play safely. The asking price was $450,000, and they paid cash. No mortgage, no monthly payments, just theirs completely. Moving day felt like the happiest day of Sarah's life. She stood in the empty living room with sunlight streaming through the windows, and she cried tears of gratitude. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But here's where things started to shift, so gradually that Sarah didn't even notice at first. Marcus began talking about investments. He'd been reading articles online, watching videos about cryptocurrency and stock trading, and he was convinced they could turn their inheritance into even more money. Sarah was hesitant. She wanted to keep most of the money safe, maybe put it in secure savings accounts and live off the interest. But Marcus was persuasive. He showed her charts and graphs, success stories of people who'd made millions. He wasn't talking about gambling everything, he said, just investing maybe $200,000 or $300,000, being strategic about it. Sarah loved her husband, trusted him completely, and she could see how excited he was about this. So she agreed. Marcus started small, investing in index funds and blue-chip stocks through a reputable brokerage firm. And at first, things went well. In the first 3 months, they made about $18,000. Marcus was ecstatic, constantly checking his phone to see how their portfolio was performing. He started spending more time on investment forums and less time with Sarah and Emma. He'd stay up late into the night, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his laptop screen, reading about market trends and investment strategies. Sarah mentioned it a few times, gently suggesting maybe he was getting a little too obsessed, but he'd kiss her forehead and tell her not to worry, that he was just trying to secure their future. Then Marcus met a man named Derek Chen at a local networking event for entrepreneurs. Derek was smooth, confident, dressed in expensive suits, and he drove a Tesla. He told Marcus about exclusive investment opportunities, private deals that weren't available to regular people, things that could triple or quadruple their money in less than a year. He talked about real estate development projects in emerging markets, cryptocurrency mining operations, and venture capital funds. Marcus was mesmerized. He came home that night talking a mile a minute, his eyes bright with excitement. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach, but she didn't say anything. Not yet. Over the next 2 months, Marcus invested another $400,000 into various opportunities that Derek presented. Some were legitimate, some were questionable, and some were outright scams, though they didn't know it at the time. Marcus became secretive about the details, telling Sarah to trust him, that she wouldn't understand the technical aspects anyway. This hurt her. They'd always made decisions together, always been a team. But now there was this wall between them, built of numbers and investments and opportunities she wasn't included in. She tried to bring it up one evening after Emma had gone to bed, telling Marcus she was worried, that maybe they should slow down and talk to a financial advisor. He snapped at her for the first time in their marriage, telling her she didn't understand how wealth building worked, that poor people stayed poor because they were too afraid to take risks. Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. She went to bed angry that night, lying on her side facing away from Marcus, tears sliding silently down her face onto the pillow. The man next to her felt like a stranger. In the morning, Marcus apologized, brought her coffee in bed, told her he'd been stressed and didn't mean it. She forgave him because that's what you do when you love someone, but the knot in her stomach had grown bigger, harder to ignore. 4 months after they'd received the inheritance, Marcus came home pale and shaking. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and she knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. He sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. Derek had disappeared. Along with $600,000 of their money. The real estate development project in Costa Rica didn't exist. The cryptocurrency mining operation was a Ponzi scheme. The venture capital fund was completely fabricated. Marcus had been conned, and he'd taken more than half of their remaining inheritance with him when he fell for it. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair. She couldn't breathe properly, like someone was standing on her chest. $600,000, just gone. Vanished into the ether with a man they'd trusted, a man Marcus had believed was going to make them rich. The police were sympathetic but not hopeful. Derek Chen wasn't even his real name. The address he'd given was a fake office space he'd rented for a few months. His phone number was disconnected. He'd done this before in 3 other states, and he was probably already setting up his next con somewhere else. The atmosphere in their beautiful new house turned toxic. Marcus was drowning in guilt and shame, barely speaking, barely eating. He'd quit his construction job months ago to focus on investing, and now he couldn't bring himself to go back, couldn't face his old coworkers and admit what he'd done. Sarah went back to working double shifts, but now it wasn't to get ahead, it was to try to stop the bleeding. Because Marcus hadn't just lost the $600,000 to Derek. He'd made other bad investments too, and as the market shifted, they started losing money in those as well. He was checking his accounts obsessively now, watching their net worth shrink day by day, and he couldn't seem to stop himself from making increasingly desperate moves trying to win it back. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And tell me honestly, would you have seen the warning signs earlier than Sarah did? Would you have stopped Marcus before it was too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I want to know what you're thinking right now. Have you ever watched someone you love destroy themselves? Have you ever felt completely powerless to stop them from making terrible decisions, even though you can see exactly where it's all heading? Sarah felt like she was watching Marcus drown in slow motion, and every time she tried to throw him a lifeline, he pushed it away. She suggested therapy. He refused. She begged him to stop trading and investing, to just preserve what they had left. He got angry, defensive, told her he knew what he was doing, that he just needed one good break and he'd win everything back. 8 months after receiving the inheritance, they had less than $400,000 left. Marcus had lost over $1 million. Sarah couldn't look at him anymore without feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak. They slept in the same bed but might as well have been on different planets. Emma, sweet Emma who was only 5 years old, started having nightmares and acting out at kindergarten. She could feel the tension in the house even if she didn't understand it, and it was affecting her in ways that broke Sarah's heart. Then one November evening, everything came crashing down completely. Sarah came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find Marcus sitting in the dark living room, an empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. He'd never been much of a drinker, so this scared her immediately. She turned on the light, and he looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. He told her he'd done something terrible. He'd taken out a loan against the house without telling her, using a forged signature, trying to get enough capital for one last investment that he was sure would turn everything around. But the investment had failed spectacularly, and now they owed $375,000 that they didn't have, and the loan was from a private lender with connections to organized crime. Sarah felt something inside her break. Not crack, but actually shatter into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't just financial ruin anymore. This was dangerous. This was the kind of debt that got people hurt, that got families threatened. She asked Marcus how he could do this, how he could risk their home, their safety, their daughter's life, without even telling her. He had no answer. He just kept crying and apologizing, saying he'd been trying to fix things, that he'd made a mistake. A mistake. As if losing over $2 million and putting them in debt to dangerous people was just a simple mistake, like forgetting to take out the trash. Sarah packed a bag for herself and Emma that night. She couldn't stay there, couldn't look at Marcus, couldn't pretend this was something they could work through. She took her daughter to her mother's house across town, and Emma cried the whole way there, asking why Daddy wasn't coming, when they were going home. Sarah had no answers. She was numb, moving on autopilot, just trying to get through each moment without completely falling apart. The next 3 months were the darkest period of Sarah's life. The private lenders started calling, then visiting the house. Marcus, alone in that beautiful home they'd bought with such hope, started having panic attacks. Sarah filed for separation, not divorce yet, but she needed legal protection from the financial devastation he'd created. The house had to be sold to pay the loan. The proceeds weren't enough, so they had to liquidate what little investments were left. In the end, after everything was settled, Sarah and Marcus had $38,000 between them from an inheritance that had started at $2.3 million. Think about that for a second. How would you feel if you'd been given over $2 million and ended up with almost nothing just 1 year later? How would you feel if the person you loved and trusted had destroyed your family's future? Would you be able to forgive them? Would you even want to? Sarah moved into a small rental apartment with Emma. It was smaller than the place they'd lived in before the inheritance, before everything fell apart. She was back to working double shifts, back to the same financial stress, but now it was worse because she knew what they'd lost. She knew they'd had a chance to change their lives forever, and it had slipped through their fingers like water. Except it hadn't slipped, it had been thrown away, gambled away, stolen by greed and poor decisions and misplaced trust. Marcus hit rock bottom in February. Sarah got a call from the hospital where he'd been taken after a suicide attempt. He'd swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills in what the doctors called a serious attempt, not a cry for help. Sarah drove to the hospital with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She was furious with him, devastated by what he'd done to their family, but he was still the man she'd married, the father of her child, and she didn't want him to die. She sat by his hospital bed while he slept off the medication they'd pumped into his stomach, and she cried harder than she'd ever cried in her life. She cried for the life they'd lost, for the man he used to be, for the innocence Emma had lost too soon, for the future that had been dangled in front of them and then snatched away. When Marcus woke up, he looked at her with such profound shame and sadness that she almost couldn't bear it. He whispered that he was sorry, that he knew sorry wasn't enough, that he'd destroyed everything. Sarah didn't know what to say. She was empty, hollowed out by grief and anger and exhaustion. She told him he needed serious help, that he couldn't come home until he got intensive therapy and treatment, and that even then, she didn't know if they could ever repair what had been broken. Marcus spent 30 days in an inpatient psychiatric facility. He was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and the doctors explained that his obsessive investing behavior had shown signs of addiction, the same patterns as gambling addiction. He'd been chasing the high of wins, unable to stop even when he was losing, convinced the next trade would be the one that fixed everything. Understanding the psychology behind it didn't make Sarah feel much better, but it helped a little. It meant he'd been sick, not just selfish. It meant maybe, just maybe, there was a version of Marcus that could be saved. 6 months later, Marcus was living in a small studio apartment and working 2 jobs, construction during the day and stocking shelves at a grocery store at night. Every penny he made beyond basic survival went to Sarah and Emma. He attended therapy twice a week and a support group for people with gambling and investment addiction. He'd given Sarah complete control of his finances, complete transparency. He was trying, desperately, painfully trying to prove he could be trusted again. Sarah was still in therapy too, working through her own trauma and anger and grief. Emma was seeing a child psychologist to help her process the upheaval in her young life. They were all broken in different ways, trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together, if that was even possible. 1 year after the inheritance had arrived, Sarah sat in her small apartment on a Friday night after Emma had gone to sleep. She was looking at old photos on her phone, pictures from when they'd first moved into the house, when they'd thought their problems were over. She looked so happy in those photos, so hopeful. She barely recognized that woman now. The inheritance that was supposed to save them had almost destroyed them completely. It had revealed fault lines in her marriage she didn't know existed. It had exposed weaknesses in Marcus that had always been there but had never been tested. It had taught her that money doesn't solve problems, it amplifies them, magnifies everything that's already inside you, both good and bad. Here's what nobody tells you about sudden wealth. It doesn't change who you are fundamentally. If you have issues with control, with addiction, with fear, with greed, the money just makes those things bigger and louder. Marcus had always been a dreamer, always believed he was meant for more, always felt like he was just one opportunity away from greatness. The inheritance gave him the means to chase that feeling, and he'd chased it right off a cliff, taking their family with him. But here's the other thing nobody tells you. Rock bottom, as terrible as it is, can be a foundation. Marcus had hit his, and he was building his way back up, slowly, brick by brick. Sarah wasn't sure if she'd ever fully trust him again, wasn't sure if their marriage could survive this, but she could see he was genuinely changed by what had happened. He'd lost his arrogance, his certainty that he knew best. He'd become humble, careful, grateful for small things. He'd started showing up for Emma's school events, playing with her at the park, being present in a way he hadn't been even before the inheritance. 2 years after the inheritance, Sarah and Marcus were officially back together, though they still lived separately. They were dating again, essentially, learning each other all over again. Marcus had paid back about $40,000 of what he'd lost, working himself to exhaustion to try to make amends. It would never be enough, they both knew that, but the effort meant something. Sarah had been promoted to a senior nursing position with better pay and more reasonable hours. Emma was thriving in 2nd grade, resilient in the way children can be when given enough love and stability. They talked about the inheritance sometimes now, able to discuss it without the conversation dissolving into accusations and tears. Marcus told her that losing everything had actually saved his life, that he'd been on a path to destruction and the crash had forced him to confront things he'd been running from his whole life. His need to prove himself, his fear of being ordinary, his deep-seated belief that he wasn't enough as he was. Sarah told him that she'd learned she was stronger than she'd ever known, that she could survive things she thought would destroy her, that she didn't need rescuing because she could rescue herself. 3 years after the inheritance, on a warm Saturday in June, Sarah and Marcus renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony in Sarah's mother's backyard. Emma was their flower girl, nearly 8 years old now, beaming with happiness that her parents were together again. It wasn't the fairy tale Sarah had imagined when she was younger. It was messier, more complicated, scarred by trauma and loss. But it was real, built on truth and hard work and genuine change. They'd been through fire and somehow made it to the other side. They never got wealthy again. Marcus's carpentry business eventually got off the ground, and he made a modest but steady income. Sarah continued nursing, finding deep satisfaction in her work helping others. They saved carefully, lived within their means, and taught Emma the value of money and the dangers of greed. The house they eventually bought was small but sufficient. The cars they drove were reliable but not fancy. They took modest vacations and celebrated small victories. And you know what? They were happy. Not in the explosive, euphoric way they'd been happy when the inheritance first arrived, but in a deeper, quieter, more sustainable way. They'd learned that enough is actually enough, that the constant striving for more can poison everything good in your life. They'd learned that trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild but is possible if both people are willing to do the work. They'd learned that the best inheritance you can give your child isn't money, it's stability, presence, and the example of how to survive your mistakes and become better. Sarah sometimes wondered what would have happened if Uncle Robert had never left them that money. Would they still be struggling in that small apartment, Marcus in construction and her working double shifts? Probably. Would they have been happier? She honestly didn't know. What she did know was that the inheritance had taught them lessons they couldn't have learned any other way, painful, expensive lessons about who they were and what really mattered. The last time Sarah drove past the big house they'd owned, the one they'd bought with such hope and lost so quickly, she felt nothing. No longing, no regret, just a quiet acknowledgement that it had been part of their story but not their ending. A different family lived there now, probably creating their own memories, facing their own challenges. She hoped they were happy there. She hoped they appreciated what they had. So here's the question I want you to think about. If you suddenly received a life-changing amount of money tomorrow, would you be ready for it? Do you know yourself well enough to handle it? Do you know your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, the places where temptation could take root? Because money doesn't create character, it reveals it. And sometimes what it reveals is something you weren't prepared to see. Sarah and Marcus's story isn't unique. There are thousands of people who've received inheritances, lottery winnings, settlements, and lost it all within a few years. The statistics are staggering. About 70% of people who receive sudden wealth lose it within a few years. The money doesn't ruin them, they were always going to struggle with these issues, but the money accelerates everything, brings it all to the surface faster and more dramatically than it would have appeared otherwise. What would you do differently if you were in Sarah's position? Would you have been more controlling about the money from the start? Would you have insisted on professional financial advice immediately? Would you have recognized the warning signs in Marcus's behavior sooner and intervened more forcefully? It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're in it, when it's your marriage and your money and your future, everything is more complicated than it looks. And what about Marcus? Can you find any compassion for him? He made terrible decisions, yes, but he was also struggling with untreated mental health issues and addiction patterns he didn't understand. Does that excuse what he did? No. Does it explain it? Maybe. Does it mean he deserved a second chance? That's not for me to decide, that was Sarah's choice to make, and she made it with her eyes wide open, understanding exactly what she was forgiving and what she was choosing to rebuild. The inheritance that destroyed everything also, in a strange way, rebuilt everything stronger. Sarah and Marcus today have something they never had before: complete honesty. No secrets, no hidden accounts, no decisions made in isolation. They've built a marriage based on transparency and communication and the hard-won knowledge that they can survive almost anything if they face it together. Is that worth $2 million? I don't know. But it's what they got, and they're making the most of it. If there's a lesson in all of this, maybe it's that money is just a tool, and like any tool, it can build or it can destroy depending on how you use it. It can amplify the best in you or the worst in you. It can solve certain problems and create entirely new ones. It can test your character in ways you never expected and reveal truths about yourself and the people you love that you might have preferred to never know. But those truths, painful as they are, can also set you free if you're brave enough to face them and strong enough to change. Sarah still works as a nurse. Marcus still does carpentry. Emma is growing up watching her parents choose each other every single day, not because it's easy, but because they've decided each other is worth the effort. They don't have millions in the bank. They probably never will. But they have something that can't be bought or inherited or invested. They have a second chance, and they're not wasting it. So what do you think about Sarah and Marcus's story? Could you forgive someone who lost over $2 million of your family's money? Would you have given Marcus a second chance, or would that have been the end? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below because I'm genuinely curious about how you'd handle this situation. And if this story impacted you, if it made you think about money and relationships and trust differently, do me a huge favor and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you appreciated the realness of this story, and subscribe if you want more true stories that make you feel something. Until next time, remember that the greatest wealth isn't what's in your bank account, it's who's standing beside you when everything else falls apart. I'll see you in the next one.